Hello, I'm Herm Gailey. We're here to continue on with this series that we started and then sort of put on the shelf for a while as we did other things on bits. We had gone through different types of snaffle bits and the way a snaffle bit works, and the time has come to consider curbs. Now, curb bits have a lot more variations even than snaffles, so we're going to break this down a bit. So today we're going to primarily focus on the role of leverage, which is the critical defining element of a curb bit. So a snaffle is a 1-on-1 or 1-to-1 ratio. You put a pound of pressure on to the horse's mouth, it comes straight back, and it's 1 pound between your hands and the mouth. There is no mechanical advantage anywhere. It's a direct, straight line pull. With a curb bit, that changes quite a lot. A curb bit involves leverage. That, again, is what makes it a curb bit. It has a chin strap or chain, and it is a fulcrum of sorts. So let's go back to the physics that I didn't pay any attention to in high school and consider a little bit what we're talking about when we think of leverage. The main factor in leverage is that you have two lever arms. You've got a short arm and a long arm, typically. And the more powerful arm, the stronger arm, is that long arm. So the person on the long arm of the lever has a mechanical advantage, and it works on a ratio. So I haven't measured this, but this is probably like a 3-to-1 ratio. You start here at the top, and from here to there is one leverage arm. On the other side of the mouthpiece is the second leverage arm. So maybe before we get into that too deeply, we ought to think about what the parts of this bit might be. From the rein ring, the headstall ring, which is here, to the middle of the mouthpiece, where the mouthpiece itself hooks on to the cheek, is the purchase. So that's going to be the short arm of the lever. The long arm of the lever is the shank, which goes from what's known as the butt, where the mouthpiece ties into the cheek, down to the rein ring. And of course the rein's attached there. So you've got the purchase, that's the top arm of the lever. You've got basically the fulcrum here at the butt, acting together with the chin strap or chain, and then you have the long arm in the form of the shank. Taken together, everything from the top of the headstall ring to the bottom of the rein ring is referred to as the cheek. And you will have people say they've got a certain length cheek or a certain length shank, and they'll use those terms interchangeably. In fact, the shank is technically from the mouthpiece down, the purchase is from the mouthpiece up, and the combination of the two, the entire side assembly there, the two leverage arms, is the cheek. And then because it's going to be involved in this leverage, we look at, I've got an interesting thing going on here, there. I'll tell you a story about that after a bit. This bit's easy to get reversed. So you have the mouthpiece, and this is where in all of this there are limitless different combinations, but there's a mouthpiece. Often there's what's called a port in the mouthpiece. Now some people would say, this isn't really a port, but there is a rise there. This could be considered a very low port or just a Mullen mouthpiece. You go a whole array of distances here. You've got this, which is almost a straight bar. You've got this Mullen with some relief there for the tongue. Then you have a typical low port, Again, the port doesn't go up very high. And you have a medium port. This is 1.5 inches, and it can be less. But above 1.5 inches, you start to get into what would be considered a high port. This would be considered a high port because this measures 2 inches. Anything above about 2 inches, the consensus is that's a high port. All of that affects where this works on the horse's mouth, how strongly it works on the horse's mouth, and the other element is the shank. You can have a simple shank like that. You can have a shank that has a complete solid connection. There's not an inch of movement in this bit. You can have a broken mouthpiece with a lot of movement in it. Compare and contrast. And we're going to have a separate episode or more about the mechanics of these different mouthpieces and how they work together with different shanks. But just to give you an idea, I mean, there are so many different variations. You've got this. That's an aluminum shank that has a fair amount of curve to it. You can get shanks that are longer, shorter, and so on. Generally speaking, the longer shank is going to be more severe, but that does depend on that ratio we started talking about. So what happens pretty obviously is you apply the leverage, and I've got my mouth here, and we're basically got the bars here and here, and the tongue. Don't have a very good tongue on my hand, but that would be the tongue that would project above the level of the bars and the bottom of the mouth. When that compresses, there's your leverage. There's your leverage. Now, what determines in large part the strength of a bit is the leverage. Not necessarily the severity, because there are a whole array of things. Different parts of the horse's mouth can be affected by different configurations. But straight up mechanical strength is dependent on this ratio. So the higher the ratio, like a bit like this, is probably 2 to 1. Just based on the shank alone, there's less strength. Or the lever alone, there's less strength. Here, it's more like a 3 to 1. So based on leverage alone, there is more strength here. So let's just sort of consider how that works. Think about your high school or maybe even college physics course and realize you didn't pay attention, and instead you say, well, I remember when I was a kid, before they were outlawed, a lot of playgrounds had seesaws that go up and go down. So let's suppose there's 2 kids. They haven't seen each other all winter. It's spring. They go out to the playground. Now these kids, we'll make them girls because girls like horses and we're talking about horses. The one girl spent the entire winter eating pudding. I mean, lots of pudding. And it had the kind of effect that sort of thing can do. The other girl spent the winter in a survival camp, trying to learn how to live off the land. And actually, she almost flunked out. So she's going to be fine after she eats more pudding, but it's a big difference in weight compared to before they went their separate ways over the winter. So they get together to get on this seesaw and have a good time, except when they sit at the end of the seesaw, well, the heavy girl just pitches that tall, or that thin girl, just sticks her right up in the air. So the survival camp girl, well, she learned a few things. She says to Puddin', slide up a little bit there, move a little closer to the center, to that fulcrum, and we'll be even. So Puddin' does that, and guess what? They can seesaw because she has just shortened the leverage arm so that even though the smaller girl doesn't have the weight, she has the mechanical advantage with the longer arm. And it's the same way with a bit. Now what happens next is what always happened with seesaws, and it's the reason why you don't often see them anymore in parks. It was coming dinner time, and the pudding girl's mama calls her, and she'd never been late to dinner in her life, and she happens to be up, or she happens to be down, I guess, would be better. So she just steps off. Well, the other girl drops like a rock. The bottom of the seesaw kicks up, hits Puddin' in the chin, knocks her cold. The other girl lands on her back, on the ground, and she's laid up and lying there, and you know, mom comes to see what's going on. One girl's unconscious, the other girl's got a broken pelvis, and they can't even tell what happened. Well, that's what happened. Because when you took that mechanical advantage away, whew, a lot of speed. Now, that's a dumb story and it's kind of a joke, except when you think about the way people use their hands, there's a lot of puddins out there. A lot of people who are abrupt with their hands. So that is the wild card here. That is the wild card. You can have a perfectly balanced bit, but no bit can make up for bad hands. No bit can make up for bad hands. Now, just quickly, it would be worthwhile to explore where this leverage goes, and that is dependent on the design of any given bit. But here are the pressure points that can be affected. First of all, as this activates, there is pressure in the chin groove when that chain or strap activates. There is also, in a bit like this, pressure on the bars of the mouth, on each side of the mouth where the bit rests in the intradental space where there are no teeth. Also, depending on the bit's design, there can be tongue pressure. There can also be, as with the snaffle, some pressure on the lips. And there can also be a certain amount of pull pressure. And with some bits, and the only bit I have here that arguably would do this, with some bits above about 2 inches, it can rotate up and it'll put pressure on the palate or the roof of the mouth. I am not, let's say, a big devotee of palate pressure bits, although some people use them to good effect. So I don't have a really good example. The great example of a palate pressure bit would be a spade bit, which has a really high mouthpiece that will rotate up and rest against the roof of the mouth. So that is basically the leverage principle of bits. You just have 2 arms and a fulcrum, and when it closes down, it activates. And that is the guts of how a curb bit works. And in later videos, we're going to go into different mouthpieces, different configurations of shanks, different bits that work in different ways on different parts of the horse's mouth to differing degrees of magnitude depending on design. Now, let me just grab something here that kind of gives people pause. Because you look at a bit like this, it's got a broken mouthpiece. Look at a bit like this, it's got a broken mouthpiece. And logically, people would say, well, this bigger bit is going to be stronger and more severe than this bit that has the shorter shank. Except you have to remember, it is about the relativities. So look at this bit, and if you go from here to here, it is precisely the same length as from here to here. And I measured it, it came out 5 and 5. I went to Les Vogt's website, who designed these bits. He says it's a 5 and 5. That means it's a 1-to-1 ratio. This bit really has no more primary force than a snaffle bit. Yet it looks almost medieval because it's so long. But half of the length is in the purchase. The other half is in the lower leverage arm, the shank. They're equal. You get a one-on-one pull. The difference from a snaffle bit in a bit like this is that there is a certain amount of leverage, and it works differently on the horse's mouth, because even though the fulcrum is equal, the lever arms are equal, you still have the fulcrum and you still have the curb chain to activate, so you'll get a little different feel of a horse's mouth than you would on a direct pull snaffle. This bit, on the other hand, is about a 2 to 1, maybe 2.5 to 1 ratio. So it is stronger because the lower leverage arm is longer in relation to the upper. The shank is longer in relationship to the purchase than this bit here, which is longer overall. I made a mess of that. Which is longer overall, but which is equal. So that's just, things are not always as they seem. So remember those things. Look at that relativity, and that will tell you about the leverage strength of the bit. Not necessarily its severity, because there are other things that come into play. You know, the way the bit is designed, the part of the mouth it works on, the texture of the bit, the diameter of the mouthpiece, all of those things make a huge difference. But as to the leverage, it is all about that ratio. That's the golden rule. Keep it in mind when you're looking at a curb bit, and we'll be visiting other elements of curb bit design down the road. Till then, keep thinking, keep riding, be well.